Hello, today is Thursday, February 4th, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. This is another podcast in our What to Watch in 2021 series. Today's topic focuses on why enterprises need to keep ahead of the ever-challenging security environment, and we'll look at some key breaches discovered at the end of last year. If you've been listening to Staying Connected or following the many news articles in December and January, you probably heard about the SolarWinds software hack and hacks related to that breach. As we pointed out before, the hack clearly highlights the vulnerability companies and governments face. On today's podcast, I'm joined by TC2's Technology Director, David Lee, and Laura McDonald, a partner at LB3, and we're going to dig a bit deeper into what this means for enterprises and provide you with some steps you'll probably want to take. Hey, David and Laura, thanks for joining me today. So, Laura, we did this on the last podcast about SolarWinds, but it's worth repeating. How about if you give a brief description of SolarWinds, its products, and why enterprises care?
Joe, thanks. It's great to be here. SolarWinds made and continues to make the headlines, and enterprises need to care about this hack for a number of reasons. First, most enterprises use some type of SolarWinds products. Second, it reinforces the vulnerability that all enterprises have, given the integration of the supply chain of software products into their networks. And third, it demonstrates the agility and persistence of the bad actors. These are all things we need to watch in 2021. So the hack occurred when malicious code was pushed to approximately 18,000 customers. And that's only a small subset of the folks who use SolarWinds products. And this is government and enterprise. And this was part of a routine software update from the SolarWinds Orion platform. Based on the level of the sophistication of the attack, it's thought to be the working of a nation-state actor, most likely Russian foreign intelligence or the SVR. Unfortunately, the hack doesn't end with the initial SolarWinds breach, and these are becoming more commonplace. Last month, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, reported that there have been advanced persistent threats, APTs, to the Microsoft 365 environment related to vulnerabilities of the SolarWinds hack. But the Microsoft breach reaches beyond SolarWinds. Approximately 1/3 of the Microsoft victims didn't run the SolarWinds software. It was independent. It's believed that the same hackers exploited the vulnerabilities in the business software by taking advantage of the way that Microsoft cloud-based software is configured. This allowed the hackers to undermine the authentication protections and the bad actors to move laterally through trust boundaries, evading defenses and detection. Recent reports have also indicated that China state actors may have perpetuated a different attack on the SolarWinds products using exposed vulnerabilities. So all in all, these hacks are a security team's nightmare. And just like last Tuesday's Groundhog Day, unfortunately, I think we all know that this is not the last that we're going to hear of these types of attacks.
Yeah, that's a good point. So David, Laura mentioned that lots of companies and government agencies were impacted by the hack. Exactly how severe was the hack?
Joe, the list of impacted institutions is now quite large and has grown since our last mid-December podcast on this topic. The list includes the Defense Information Systems Agency, Department of Homeland Security, Treasury, State Department, Department of Commerce, which FAA is part of, NIH, the White House, Secret Service, Pentagon, and all branches of the military, to name those that have been reported so far. And that does not include the list of corporations, for example, McDonald's. In addition, as Laura just mentioned, we also know that the Russian hackers have spied on Microsoft source code to look for methods and procedures to avoid malware detecting tripwires.
So do we now have a better idea of how the bad actors did this and the impact?
Joe, we have a better idea, but the forensic search is on, so stay tuned. But what folks are really struggling with right now is no one knows how far the bad actors were able to tunnel in. To quote CISA, it is likely that the adversary is in a strong position to identify any potential and as yet unknown vulnerabilities in the SolarWinds Orion code that are unrelated to the inserted malicious code and therefore may survive its removal. In other words, you may get rid of the code, but not rid of the avenues for attack. But it's important to note that as sophisticated as this hack was, Joe, SolarWinds and perhaps some of these agencies could have prevented or delayed the attack. There were some reports, Brian Krebs reported, that SolarWinds was notified in 2019 by a bug hunter that their download website had a weak password. Now, it's not clear if that opened a path or a vulnerability, but it reminds us that there are things that enterprises can do and should do to build up their protections.
So, okay, David, now that you've had some time to reflect on this hack, is there anything, in your opinion, that companies could have done to prevent the hack or do going forward to prevent another?
Right, Joe. It's been nearly 2 months since being first reported by FireEye, but the question in the mind of most enterprise leadership is, what can an enterprise do to prevent this in the future? After all, SolarWinds was known as a reliable, easy to use, and was very credible software provider and is with many government agencies as their customer at the time. But this is not the first time. So we don't blame SolarWinds on this as a first-time situation. Back in 2017, software supply chains have been hacked, causing hundreds of millions of dollars of lost revenue and IT remediation costs, and those have been reported to impact sophisticated U.S. multinationals such as Merck and FedEx. So as a starting point, what we'd recommend is enterprises need to clearly catalog their software vendors, what information they can get access to, and what are the legitimate must-have information exchanges with that software vendor. In addition, we recommend an enterprise investigate the software supply chain and the security and reliability of the chain of custody of that software. They also need to perform research as well as audit the integrity of their software vendors' related software operations. So it's important to note that this should be an ongoing effort, not just part of the initial procurement due diligence around the contract signing, but a periodic review going forward.
All right, so once companies do that, what's next?
Well, as part of this research and software vendor audit I just mentioned, enterprises should know how many software bug fixes and patches does that vendor release in a year. Does the patching cadence feel continuous, for example? Determine what methods and procedures the software vendor requires to do the patches. For example, is it automated and hitless to reduce end-user downtime and to minimize misconfigurations, or does it require too many manual interventions or custom scripting on the part of your IT staff? Other steps include network and user segmentation to reduce access to information that is stored and in transit, and enterprises can deploy security at the user access layer, thereby detecting and preventing an attack at its origin, preventing the attack at or close to the equivalent of patient zero. Finally, and likely the most under-acknowledged preventative method, and Laura just mentioned some of the very recent information about the lateral and other ongoing attacks in some of the software, is the training of the individual end user to be on the alert for spear phishing attacks or any suspicious communications coming from email, text messages, social media, or calls disguised as a marketing or survey call to gather intelligence. This training should then be followed up with white hat attacks and simulations to test these users' knowledge. These preventative and remediation requirements should also be part of your enterprise planning.
Okay, Laura, since you're the lawyer here, what can companies do from a contract perspective?
Joe, that's a great question, but I want to step back for a second to what David said, because I know I'm stating the obvious, but every enterprise should perform their due diligence right at the beginning and throughout. So right at the beginning, start with a competitive RFP process to select the vendor that's going to be the most reliable, the most efficient, and have the most secure solution, regardless of the brand, regardless of what their reputation is. So start out, and this really will help you in the contracting process, by crafting and using a good RFP to help scope. And then, because once we get to the contract, it's going to protect you and give you some remedies if things go awry, but it can't protect you from a bad vendor. It can't make a bad vendor a better one. Concerning contracts, let's just kind of divide things into what's practical and what's unrealistic. It's unlikely that you're going to get a full indemnification from a vendor for hacks. I'd love that, but that's unlikely. In fact, most vendor contracts they'll start with a waiver of liability, of all liability, even if they're providing security services that are related to hacks or unauthorized use. Obviously, you got to get to a middle ground, but it's not easy to get there. There are some other kind of practical protections that are helpful from an operations standpoint, and you can build these into your contract, and this would be in addition to those that are required by law or by your industry. And these are really things that people think about, but don't always think about actually including in their contract that I would recommend. First of all, enterprises should seek clauses that address detection of unauthorized use and cooperation if there is a breach. Plan ahead for the breach. We know that they come, so put provisions in your contract to address that, escalation points and the like. The contract should include a timely notification clause that requires a rapid notification of any potential as well as actual breach, so you can get ahead of the issue. At a minimum, include quarterly meeting obligations, and these obligations should include reviewing the vendor software supply chain because that impacts you as well as audit rights and or demonstration of compliance with security requirements. You also want to make sure that your supplier is required to provide timely patches with known security bugs, that they themselves use safe authentication standards, that they meet industry best practices for themselves and they required of their supply chain. And let's face it, no respectful supplier should balk at complying with an ISO or similar standard. You also want redundancy and resilient clauses. Suppliers should have a plan and should be making sure that if there's a problem, they will protect your infrastructure and data as well as ensure continued service. Now, they may not put the plan in your contract, but they should have a plan and they should be able to articulate it in a confidential and secure way. And I also have to note that this is not a substitute for you and your obligations to ensure your own redundancy and resilience solutions. And anytime you're using a single source, that's a real issue. Obviously, the above list is not inclusive. There are a lot more provisions that you can negotiate, and a lot of that depends on the circumstances and what you're purchasing. But you have to realize that even with the best contractual protections, you can't outsource responsibility. And vendors are going to be reluctant to give any protections or remedies that make them vulnerable. And frankly, everyone is really gun shy right now. However, in our experience working with vendors, if you're thoughtful and persistent, you can agree on some meaningful and practical provisions. So make sure you build in the time to get those.
Laura, good overview. And remember, you're only as strong as your weakest link, and no link is impenetrable. I'll preview for folks that we will be doing a podcast in the near future that takes a closer look at security, particularly in the SASE, SD-WAN, and cloud environments, with more information about what to look for.
Okay, thanks, David, and thank you as well, Laura. Okay, folks, these hacks, they aren't going away. So if you want to have a discussion about this or other security challenges that may have exposed your company, or you need some help factoring security in when you're developing your 2021 ICT plan, please give David, Laura, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues a call, or just drop us an email. You can also stay current by subscribing to these Staying Connected podcasts, checking out our websites, or by following us on LinkedIn.